The rain's echo, a true scary story. I've always found the sound of rain soothing. Ever since I was a child, the gentle patter of droplets against the windows would lull me into sleep, washing away the noise of the world and cradling me in a cocoon of tranquility. It was comforting, a natural lullaby. But that was before I learned what the rain could hide. Now, every time I hear it, I'm reminded of that night, and sleep has become something I fear. This story isn't one I've told many people. It's too strange, too real, and even now, thinking about it makes my heart race. But if I don't share it, it feels like the memories will consume me. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe the rain will help you sleep like it once did for me until you learn its secrets. It was a few years ago, during the summer, when the heat had become unbearable. The humidity clung to everything, turning the air into something thick and stifling. Sleep was hard to come by on those nights, but a storm had rolled in, and the steady downpour offered a reprieve from the suffocating heat. I lived alone in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was quiet, isolated, and nestled right at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles. The kind of place where people minded their own business and strangers rarely passed through. That night, the rain came down harder than usual. Sheets of water slammed against the windows, and the rumble of thunder occasionally echoed through the sky. I pulled my blankets tighter around me, thankful for the cool breeze that slipped through the small crack in the window. The rhythmic sound of raindrops was comforting, and it wasn't long before my eyelids grew heavy. Just as I was drifting off, a loud noise jerked me awake, a sharp, insistent knock at the front door. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 2:18 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be knocking at this hour? I lived far enough from town that no one ever showed up unannounced, and especially not in the middle of a storm. My first thought was that someone had gotten lost or stranded in the downpour, but even then, why come here? My apartment wasn't visible from the main road, and I hadn't heard a car. Another knock, louder this time. I sat up, straining to listen over the rain. The sound was persistent, like whoever was on the other side was desperate. My mind raced, debating whether to open the door or pretend I wasn't home. Then, a voice, low, muffled by the storm, but undeniably there. Please help me. A chill crawled down my spine. It was a woman's voice, shaky and weak. My thoughts shifted. What if someone was hurt? My stomach knotted at the thought of leaving someone out there, in the rain, in the dark. I slid out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and hesitated before making my way to the door. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the wind howling outside. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the knob, unsure whether to open it. The voice came again, softer now. Please let me in. It's so cold. Something wasn't right. The voice, there was something off about it. It sounded hollow, as if it were echoing from far away, yet it was so close. I peered through the peephole, but the rain distorted everything outside. All I could make out was a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the porch, drenched in the downpour. I swallowed hard, my instinct screaming at me to ignore it, to go back to bed and lock the door. But then another knock came, slower this time, almost a pleading tap. Reluctantly, I turned the knob and opened the door just enough to see outside. The rain poured down in torrents, and a flash of lightning illuminated the figure on the porch. She was small, with long, dark hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through. She looked frail, vulnerable. Her eyes, there was something strange about them, something I couldn't quite place. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rain. The woman didn't answer right away. She stood there, shivering, staring at me with those unsettling eyes. Then, finally, she whispered, "Can I come in?" I hesitated, my hand still gripping the door. Something about her made my skin crawl, but I couldn't leave her out there in the storm. Against my better judgment, I opened the door wider and stepped aside. She entered without a word, dripping water onto the floor as she moved past me. I closed the door behind her, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The woman stood in the middle of my living room, her head lowered, water pooling at her feet. She hadn't looked at me again since stepping inside, and the air around her seemed colder, as if the storm had followed her in. I cleared my throat, trying to break the silence. "Do you need help? I can call someone." "No," she interrupted, her voice sharp but still soft. "No one will come." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just her shock talking, that maybe she had been through something traumatic. "All right, well, let me get you a towel," I offered, stepping toward the bathroom. "No," she said again, and this time, her voice was firmer. "Stay." I froze. The unease that had been building since I opened the door surged into full-blown fear. I turned back to face her, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The woman wasn't wet anymore. Her clothes, which had been soaked through just moments ago, were now dry, as though she had never stepped foot in the rain. The water that had pooled beneath her was gone, vanished without a trace. My mouth went dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The woman slowly lifted her head, and this time, I got a good look at her face. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her eyes. Those eyes weren't right. They were empty, hollow, black as the night outside. There was no light in them, no soul. Just an endless void. A smile curled at the corners of her lips, but it was a cold, cruel smile, one that made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have let me in," she whispered, her voice like a breath of wind through the trees. I stumbled back, my legs weak beneath me. What are you?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow step toward me, her movements unnaturally fluid, like she was gliding across the floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging the air. My heart pounded in my chest, terror gripping every inch of me. I backed away, my eyes darting toward the door. If I could just make it outside, get to a neighbor, maybe. She moved faster than I expected, closing the distance between us in an instant. Her hand shot out, cold as ice, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like iron. I gasped, trying to pull away, but her strength was impossible. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You invited me in," I screamed, trying to wrench myself free, but it was no use. Her grip tightened, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges as my strength faded. Just as I thought I would pass out, the front door burst open, and a gust of wind howled through the apartment, sending papers flying and knocking over a lamp. The woman recoiled, her grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled to my feet, running for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I flung myself into the storm, the rain drenching me instantly, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I ran down the road, the rain pouring harder than ever, the thunder rumbling in the distance. My feet pounded against the pavement, splashing through puddles, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I reached the house of a neighbor, pounding on their door with all the strength I had left. When they finally opened the door, I collapsed inside, gasping for breath, drenched to the bone. The police arrived shortly after, but when they searched my apartment, they found no sign of the woman. There was no water on the floor, no evidence that anyone had been there. They chalked it up to a nightmare brought on by stress and the storm, but I knew better. I never saw her again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Every time it rains, I'm reminded of her, of those hollow eyes and that cold, cruel smile. The sound of rain used to help me sleep. Now, it only keeps me awake, because I know that the rain can hide things that should never be let inside. So, the next time you hear a knock on your door in the middle of a storm, think twice before you answer.